What people who want to construct fantasies about a kind of hidden author behind the plays, what they do is they take little coincidences, arbitrary parallels, and try to weave them together into a coherent narrative. I could as easily map the life of Elvis Presley onto a work by Shakespeare as I could map the life of Lord Burleigh or the Earl of Oxford.
I must point out that I have no idea if Sir Jonathan contributes to the Oxford site. I use the film clip as a placeholder for Oxford ideas only. But before Sir Jonathan maps Elvis Presley onto a work by Shakespeare, he could do a practice exercise of mapping the life of the man from Stratford onto the works of Shakespeare. A man who in all personal documents never spelled his name as Shakespeare, in that there is no E after the K in his name in his personal as opposed to his business records. Take, for example, the baptism registry. S-H-A-K, no E, S-P-E-R-E. Then there's the plaque under the bust in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. I boxed it in red, Shakspere, not Shakespeare. His will, different spelling, S-H-A-C-K, spear, but no E after the K. In a time when spelling was inconsistent, the man from Stratford was very consistent in never having an E after the K in his name. It's odd that Oxford insists that the plays were by the man from Stratford because his name is on them. Well, his name isn't on them because he himself never spelled his name as Shakespeare on personal or family documents. The Oxford response to this is that Elizabethan spelling was inconsistent, which it was, so you mustn't rely on it. Well, you can't have it both ways. You can't say it must be the man from Stratford because his name is close enough, and because spelling was inconsistent, we're going to ignore the fact that he himself, in every instance of personally using his name, never once spelled it with an E after the K, and never once wrote it with a hyphen, as 45% of the author's works were, the sonnets being a good example. But let's leave all that aside and go back to Sir Jonathan mapping the life of Shakespeare of Stratford as a practice exercise before he maps Elvis Presley to the works of Shakespeare. What documentation of the life of William of Stratford would he have to work with? There are some 70-plus primary source documents referring to the man from Stratford, i.e. William Shakspere. It is crucially important to know that these documents constitute the only unambiguous primary source evidence we have for the man from Stratford. Everything else we read in biographies, which assume the man from Stratford is the author, is posthumous, impersonal evidence comprising hearsay, fantasy, and myth. My 9-slide summary of the unambiguous primary source evidence we have for the man from Stratford is colour-coded. Red is personal life, baptism, marriage-related, that kind of thing, as we see here. Black is business-related, not theatre. Blue is theatre business. I shall go quickly through the rest of the documents, but you can always pause the video to examine them for yourself. So to summarise, from birth to death, all these primary source documents record the life of a businessman with not one connection to a literary life. I've used them to map the life of William Shakspere from Stratford onto the works of Shakespeare. William's father was a glove maker, and indeed in the works of Shakespeare you do find references to gloves. Shakespeare's son Hamnet sounds like Hamlet. Sonnet 145 contains the line, "I hate a way she threw," that is supposed to reference Hathaway. Sonnet 135 has 7 mentions of the word will, and as for the Warwickshire dialect connection, I highly recommend you Google Ros Barber Warwickshire dialect for a thorough debunking of that. Now, Sir Jonathan says that there are little coincidences and arbitrary parallels about Edward de Vere when his life is mapped onto the works of Shakespeare. Let's look at just a fraction of those little coincidences and arbitrary parallels for Edward de Vere. Edward de Vere's father, the 16th Earl, was married to the sister of Arthur Golding, the translator of Ovid's Metamorphoses. I think this is the kind of little coincidence or arbitrary parallel of Edward de Vere Sir Jonathan was talking about. The fact that Edward de Vere's uncle was the source in English for many of Shakespeare's plays. Let's find some more, shall we? The 2 children from the marriage of John de Vere and Margaret Golding were Edward and Mary. Mary was married to Peregrine Bertie, Lord Willoughby, a one-time representative to the royal court in Denmark. During his stay at Elsinore Castle, he records having met a person called Guildenstern and 2 people called Rosencrantz. Another little coincidence. Edward's first marriage was to Anne Cecil, considered by many historians and biographers to be the model for Ophelia in Hamlet. She was the daughter of William Cecil, regarded by nearly everybody, Sir Jonathan being an exception, as the model for Polonius in Hamlet. The 3 children who survived infancy were Elizabeth, Bridget and Susan. From early in her life, William Cecil wanted Elizabeth to marry Henry Risley, the 3rd Earl of Southampton, but the Earl was not interested. And who was Henry Risley? He was the person to whom the first work to bear the name Shakespeare, that's the poem Venus and Adonis, was dedicated. Clearly just a little coincidence. Edward's second daughter Bridget, who was a ward of William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, was part of a marriage settlement drawn up with one William Herbert, offering £3,000 and an annuity to begin at the death of William Cecil. This, however, was not acceptable to the young William, who wanted the annuity to commence immediately, and thus the negotiations ended and the marriage never took place. William Herbert was the brother of Philip Herbert, and Philip Herbert was Susan de Vere's husband. So what? Well, it turns out that either through being a little coincidence or an arbitrary parallel, these 2 brothers were the most noble and incomparable pair of brethren, the dedicatees to whom the 1623 First Folio of the works of Shakespeare was dedicated. There are only 3 dedicatees in all the works of Shakespeare. The first on the first work to bear his name, and the other 2 on the First Folio. 2 of those dedicatees were considered candidates for marriage to 2 of the daughters of Edward de Vere, and the 3rd dedicatee was married to a daughter of Edward de Vere. Putting all this together, we have, by my count, 7 little coincidences and arbitrary parallels between the life of Edward de Vere and the works of Shakespeare. And these are but the tip of the iceberg, a tiny fraction of the evidence, as my other videos will show. But for Sir Jonathan, these are little coincidences and arbitrary parallels that presumably pale in comparison to the following pieces of clear evidence for mapping the life of William Shakspere onto the works of Shakespeare. I leave it as an exercise for the viewer to choose which of the arguments is stronger. Now, at this point, people might be tempted to say, but absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. There are lots of authors from Elizabethan times for whom we have very little documentation of their literary lives. Is that true? Diana Price is an independent scholar who pioneered the phrase literary paper trails to give credence to the belief that a person was an author in Elizabethan times. Or in other words, to be acknowledged as a writer in the Elizabethan period, there would be evidence in at least one of these 10 categories. You can pause to read them all, but I will go on. Price took 24 authors and placed check marks against them in the appropriate literary paper trail boxes, and this is what she found. It shows, amongst other things, why there isn't a Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe authorship question. We have evidence that they were authors. You will have noticed one missing name, William Shakspere. I've added it at the bottom. For him, there is absolutely nothing. An extraordinary claim, which requires extraordinary evidence. So if I say unambiguous primary source evidence, I do so for a reason. That's precisely the kind of evidence we do have for 24 contemporaneous authors. Why should Shakespeare get a free pass? He should not.